Thank you for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar today, Accelerated Learning, a Reporter's Guide to a Key Strategy for COVID-19 Education Recovery. I'm Eric Robelin, the Deputy Director at EWA. Before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. If you have a query for our speakers, please type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Include your name and affiliation. You can submit a question at any time. We'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Also keep an eye on the chat box today, where I will post some resources from our speakers. As soon as the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is very important and helps us to improve. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Sarah Schwartz, who is a reporter at Education Week on the curriculum and instruction beat. I actually had that beat at Education Week many years ago. So I'm so glad to have her here today. She's written several stories about the topic of today's webinar of accelerated learning. So she's going to introduce the topic and say a little about our speakers. And then start thinking about your questions, which you can post in the question box all along, and we'll take as many as we can when we get to the Q&A. Sarah, the floor is yours. Oh, you are, I think you're muted, Sarah. Still muted. Up in the right corner, the microphone at the green icon.
Okay, how about now? All right,
Perfect.
Great. Good, off to a great start. So thanks, Eric. I'm excited to be here today to talk with you all about acceleration, what it is, how to spot it, and hopefully to give you all some story ideas. And I'm joined today by two guests, Jamila Newman, who's a partner with TNTP, and Penny Schwinn, the Commissioner of Education for the Tennessee Department of Education. So thank you both for joining us here today. And like Eric mentioned, I've covered accelerated learning a little bit. So I'm going to kick us off by talking a bit about how I understand it and how I've tried to explore it in my reporting. So over the past 2 years, I've been pretty focused on the pandemic's effect on student learning as a reporter on the curriculum and instruction beat. And I think for a lot of us, we may have heard of acceleration before as an option for students in gifted education, something that enables kids who want to move faster or go deeper to do so. But it has a slightly different meaning in the context of COVID era instruction and in how it can be a strategy for planning instruction amid COVID-related disruptions. And so as I understand it, and our guests today can challenge my understanding or add to it, accelerated learning is a way for students to have access to grade level instruction, even if they've missed key understandings or key knowledge from previous grades. So a 7th grade math teacher, for example, would teach 7th grade content, even if students had gaps from 6th grade. She would weave in that 6th grade, those 6th grade concepts and skills as she teaches the 7th grade curriculum. And this is different than what schools often do. So often when kids are behind, if they're on below grade level, schools will give them below grade level work. And the idea behind that is trying to meet kids where they are to give them work that they can do. But the problem is that this strategy doesn't work so well for catching kids up. And that's because if you're a 5th grader who's working on 4th grade skills, your fellow 5th graders are working on 5th grade skills. And so even if everyone is continuing to move ahead at the same pace, there isn't much of a mechanism for accelerating the group of students who are behind so that they can catch up. And a lot of education experts, and I'm sure we'll talk about this today, point out that at its heart, this is a big equity issue. And even before the pandemic, Black and Latino students were more often slotted into remediation classes. And during the pandemic, we know that Black and Latino students were hit hardest in a lot of ways. They were most likely to have family members who caught COVID. They were less likely to have access to remote learning during some of those early days of the pandemic. And experts say that the response to these inequities cannot be to put Black and Latino students into remediation classes, because this is only going to broaden some of the inequities that already exist and deprive students of the kind of meaty, interesting, challenging work that that their peers are getting. So as a reporter, there are a couple of different ways that I've kind of tried to get at what does it actually look like if a school is trying to do something different, if they're trying to use acceleration. And I think the most useful way to explain it is to talk about what it actually looks like in a classroom. And so one example from my reporting that I can share, I talked to an 8th grade math teacher in California. Her students came into this year with a big range in abilities. She had some that were ready for 8th grade work. She had some who were more at a 7th or 6th grade level. So she and the other 8th grade teachers, they looked through the curriculum together, and they picked out a handful of math skills that were going to be the most important for their students, that would set them up for success in 9th grade, which for them is Algebra 1. And so they're focusing on those skills that year, and they're slowing down so that they can differentiate lessons for students' needs. So the 8th graders in her class who are at a 6th grade level, she's not giving them 6th grade work. Instead, she's giving them 8th grade work, and she's supporting them to do that 8th grade work by teaching them the 6th and 7th grade skills that they need to understand it as she goes along. And as it maybe sounds, the teacher has said it's very hard and it takes a lot of planning to do this. And they've had to jettison a ton of the curriculum so that they can slow down in this way. And when I talked to her in December, she said that they'd spent most of the first half of the year on one skill, which was understanding linear equations. But on the flip side, she said that all of her kids now understand linear equations. So they're able to bring that skill with them into Algebra 1, and hopefully that can set them up for success. But as you can see from this example, this takes a lot of planning, cooperation, both among teachers, but also at a systems level. And so when I am talking to districts about this, I ask questions like, how are you supporting teachers to do this? What kind of training are you giving them? Do you give them time to plan and to work together? Has the district released updated pacing guides to help teachers identify what those kinds of priority content should be in those skills? Is there any flexibility there? And I'm excited to talk about some of those questions today, and hopefully give you all some story ideas, and our guests can answer questions as well. And so with that, I'm going to, I think, turn it over to Jamila Newman, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the resources and guidance that TNTP has put out, and also sort of, how we can conceptualize acceleration, and how we should be thinking about it as we're looking at it in schools and districts.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Sarah's done a great job of just kind of laying the foundation and giving us a high-level overview of what learning acceleration looks like in practice. Is everybody able to see my screen okay, my slide? Okay, perfect. So if people are unfamiliar with TNTP, TNTP is an organization that has been around for a number of years, over 20 years, and we are lucky enough to partner with so many districts and systems and states across the country, including Tennessee, and it's good to see you, Commissioner Schwinn. And what this really gives us is a great vantage point of like what's happening with students and what are students experiencing on the ground, and then being able to share that with our partners and even broadly with members of the journalism community as well. And so this is just to give you a quick snapshot of some of the systems and states that we're currently partnering with, to give you an idea of the vantage point that we're able to have when we talk about the work of learning acceleration. Many of you may know us more from like the research arm of our organization. Every several years we present and publish our national report, the most recent one of which is the Opportunity Myth, that really described some of the gaps in our educational system that we argued educators like myself have a locus of control over. The grade level materials that students have access to, high expectations that students have access to, the instruction that students receive, et cetera. And once we published this in 2018, we began to really chart a path for what it would take to give or increase students access to those 4 resources and success with those 4 resources. So well before COVID, way back in 2018, that feels like a far off memory, we articulated that some of the things that were holding students back from high quality instruction or access to the opportunities that that should be afforded to them in college and career, one of the things holding them back were just substandard instructional materials. We also felt like over remediation was holding students back, and disjointed student experiences were holding students back. So our strategic plan that we've just engaged in as an organization has really started to map out for us, like, how do we start to kind of eradicate some of the barriers that students may be experiencing. A few of the things that we're doing is starting to talk about and have conversations about the topic that is on our radar for today, learning acceleration. First, we've been talking to systems like Tennessee for a number of years, who's already ahead of the curve in a lot of these ways, about high quality materials, why they matter, and really trying to grow the demand within systems and communities for higher quality instructional materials. And then we started to kind of publicize some of the research, to be honest, that has been around for a number of years, but systems hadn't been really taking hold of, around like what we should be doing instead of over remediation or extensive reteaching. And then we've been talking a lot about the connection between accelerated learning and instructional program coherence, which I'll talk about in just a second. So Sarah has really painted a picture for what acceleration is, but as just a quick snapshot, when we're talking about remediation, I think it's important that we address that we're talking about it in practice. In theory, when I was in grad school, remediation sounds so brilliant. Like, you encounter students who are behind, and before you move forward, you try to catch them up on what they might be missing, and then you do this quickly, and then you move on. That is what's happening in theory. And a lot of times when we talk about learning acceleration and we present an alternative, people are like, well, wait, remediation sounds great. Yes, it sounds great. But what we're actually seeing happen in practice is that often systems and educators and leaders are focusing on and drilling students in really isolated skills that often bear no resemblance to either grade level standards or even the content of the grade level. So students are spending an inordinate amount of time on content from prior grades that really isn't setting themselves up for grade level content. The big difference and the bottom line difference between learning acceleration and remediation, as Sarah mentioned, is that it anchors children and educators to grade level content. We are supporting students with content from the prior grade, but it is strategically done. It is really prioritized content, and it is content that we as educators are acknowledging are active gateways to students accessing grade level content. And you're doing it as quickly and succinctly as possible to get students back into grade level content. As a visual learner, this is an often helpful visual that I use often in my trainings. But if you could imagine, what we typically see is, if the content at the top, A, B, and C, is content from prior grades, what typically happens in systems is at the beginning of the year, we might present students with something like a universal screener, some type of large-scale diagnostic that helps us place or position where students are in their level of proficiency. What often happens is educators look at the results from that diagnostic and they say, well, oh wow, Johnny is missing or has all these gaps in all these standards from prior grades. I have to catch this student up, because in our mind's eye, it doesn't make sense to push students forward without kind of doing that corrective instruction on everything that they've missed. And while it might feel really logical for us to place all of that prior knowledge at the beginning of the year, which is what often happens, it actually doesn't align to what we know about brain-based learning science research and what students actually need. In fact, this type of instruction is what brain-based researchers call like the mass or blocked practice that we often have experienced ourselves, more likely as students, where we crammed. We said, oh, I got to learn all of this really quickly because I have a big test. And while that might work for a short time, it doesn't lead to that like long-standing instructional learning that we need students to have, that they can carry over and carry past the summer or a long spring break or a rain delay or a snow day or whatever, because it was just that really quick instructional practice. And what we often find happening is that A, B, and C content from prior grades is the extent of what students are experiencing in their grade levels. And then come February, January, when state tests are looming, all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, we've got to get students ready for this state exam. So that's the first time they encounter grade level materials, which here is represented in D or yellow. But again, because it's short, it's now only done in the last quarter of the year or the last half of the year. Even then, it's not done with instructional best practice. It's often done skills, drilling, Scantron sheets, short passages, etc., because there's not enough time to really engage in meaningful instructional practice. So what we offer is an alternative to that really describes the process that educators should go through and engage in, that Sarah's already mentioned when it comes to learning acceleration. The first step before you do anything is that educators really have to study and understand the concepts of the grade level. Don't look at the universal screener first or the student data first. Go to your grade level content first and really understand, what do students really need to know, understand, be able to do at the end of this year, so that you can better pinpoint the materials or content from prior grades that is absolutely essential. Once you've done that, you want to diagnose your students using those current grade level materials to understand where there might be gaps in their formal or informal knowledge, right? And you want to potentially use more informal diagnostic tools that are much more closely related to the grade level materials, ideally from the high quality curricular materials that you're using within your sites, to really pinpoint at the unit level or the lesson level where students might encounter challenges. And then that's when you want to adjust your content and take action based off of the gaps that you've seen in terms of students' instructional knowledge. So if we go back to that previous visual, it looks a lot different. So I might assess my students at the beginning of the year and recognize that, yes, Johnny does have gaps from the previous years, but rather than throwing in content B standards, I recognize now as a teacher, because I've deeply studied my content and concepts, that this is not a gateway standard for that student. So I'm not even going to think about it. I don't have to teach every single grade, every single subject that came before me. I'm only going to really be concerned about the content that matters most. And rather than putting it all at the beginning of the year, all of that prior grade content at the beginning of the year, I'm going to space it throughout the year and have it falling in front of the units or the modules where it is most applicable for the student, so that they can actually apply that knowledge most readily and immediately to the grade level content that they're learning. Again, if we align this to what we know from brain-based research, this really aligns to the principles of interleaving and spaced practice that scientists have found are much more effective in terms of giving us that longitudinal learning that we know students need. So this is what acceleration looks like. And I just want to dive in. It's so funny that Sarah and I both picked a math example, because I'm going to dive into a math example just quickly. But I want to just highlight a few things that we encourage stakeholders and educators to do. So you do want to prioritize and anchor to grade level content, but you're not prioritizing, meaning narrowing the standards that are covered with grade level content. You are not removing standards and saying, oh, because I'm learning acceleration, I'm not going to focus on calculus, I'm only going to focus on biology or whatever. You're going to give students and present students with all grade level content. And that's really critical and important, because most high quality standards that are present in our country today, be they Common Core, or even in states that have not adopted Common Core, but have kind of adopted Common Core, they have already been focused enough. They have been made coherent and focused and narrowed enough so that if you spend time prioritizing or removing standards, you're actually disrupting the coherence that students will experience in those standards, which is all the more detrimental to students who may be behind. So the first kind of like knee-jerk reaction I would have if I'm in the field, I feel like I want to be like the reporter getting in there. If I'm a reporter getting in there and someone says to me, we spend a lot of time prioritizing and narrowing our standards, that would be my first indication that I want to dig in a little bit more, because we want to prioritize standards from the prior grades, narrow our focus on the standards from the prior grades, but not the grade level content and materials. And this is really what this second piece means. We want to prioritize the prerequisite standards, content, concept, skills from prior grades for students that really act as gateways or barriers to accessing the content of the current grade. You want to prioritize, again, evidence-based, effective instructional practices and strategies. When people start really getting trained with us on learning acceleration, they're like, wait, this is just high quality, strong instruction. And we're like, yep, it sure is. It is not kind of a magic bullet. It is not like you're doing something different. But what you do need to do with learning acceleration is make sure everyone within your system is really clear about how time should be spent in instruction, where the bulk of time should be spent, what practices really matter most. So for example, if I was a K2 leader in a K2 classroom, I would be making sure everyone realizes that at least 45 minutes of foundational skills instruction is critical for students to learn to read. And so I would have that prioritized as a key instructional strategy that everyone in my system knows. I said a minimum, it is, I would max it out even more, but at least we're having that every single day. You want to prioritize collaborative long-term planning and just strategic planning. This is not something that should happen overnight. This is not something that should really happen in isolation. Teachers will need to be working and partnering with their leadership, other teachers in their grade levels, vertical planning, etc. And so really carving that time out to make sure that teachers and leaders have the time that they need. What I really think is important to acknowledge is that learning acceleration should not be isolated to a particular moment in instruction. So we've seen with ESSER funding where everyone who is trying to support learning acceleration might be thinking like, oh, this is a high dosage tutoring thing, or this is a tier 2 service or a tier 3 service. The principles of learning acceleration should actually permeate every level of your instructional program and weave throughout your core instruction, your interventions, your high dosage tutoring, because that's what really speaks to a level of coherence that's incredibly important for the student experience. So we shouldn't see people like necessarily thinking that what I'm doing in high dosage tutoring covers or cares for the learning acceleration piece. We should see people recognizing that there needs to be a connection with core instruction. And that is incredibly helpful when we talk about high quality instructional materials, which we really feel like is a critical foundation piece to making learning acceleration work. So that's the next thing that I would look for in a system. Like if a system says they're doing learning acceleration overnight, you probably got some questions. And if a system says we're doing learning acceleration without high quality materials, you might have a challenge. So I want to just share a quick example from math. This is using a unit from Eureka Math, which is a high quality instructional tool. Lots of strong systems across the country have adopted Eureka Math. And this is a 5th grade example. So if I am a 5th grade teacher and this system is engaging in learning acceleration, this is what my work would look like. I would get my information on my unit, and I would see that this unit covers the following standards here in this gray box. I would I would look at like a coherence map to see what are all the standards from prior grades that relate to or are critical prerequisites to this particular standard. So I look at the coherence maps that are available online. Louisiana has them. Student Achievement Partners has them. Lots of illustrative math, lots of tools have materials that let you know what standards are critical before. So I would do that for every single standard that's being covered in this particular unit. And I would learn that there are kind of like seven-ish prerequisite standards. I would then diagnose my students on those prerequisite standards to see, what do my students know? What don't they know that might act as barriers to this particular 5th grade unit? After I diagnose, going back to my visual here, at the top, these green and red standards were all the standards that I needed to cover that are prerequisite standards to my 5th grade unit materials. When we say prerequisite standards, it doesn't even mean that students have to master that content before they can engage in grade level materials. That's the other important thing about learning acceleration. We don't want so much time spent on prior grade materials that, again, we lose sight of what grade level instruction needs to be about. Students just need to have enough knowledge, have built enough knowledge about those prior grade materials that they can now, it acts as an entry point into grade level content. So now if I'm planning for my unit, I go back and I've diagnosed A and B, I align and adjust my instruction, and I take action. And it looks like I would do like a quick mini lesson or mini study on a few of those standards in the in the green, not as much on B, because that's not what students needed, or that's not what this particular student needed to get into this grade level content. The other thing that would be important is that this 5th grade teacher has been given instruction to do some critical instructional moves like these in their math classroom as opposed to others. So again, rather than adhering blindly to the pacing guide that Sarah mentioned before, they're using formative data to really make adjustments to their instruction. I'm going to stop here. Hopefully this has painted a clear picture. I know I've gone over time, and I'm going to pass it to Penny, who's going to give some more information about what this has looked like on the ground. I can stop sharing.
Okay, wonderful. I am not sure if you can see my screen or not. Do you want to go ahead and do that? Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and dive in on some of the things that we are doing here in Tennessee, specific to our education recovery efforts, especially after the pandemic. And so I think one of the biggest things is that we've been working our strategic plan since before the pandemic, and that had 3 clear components. The first was academic, the second is student readiness, and the third is on educators. And for each of those components, we wanted to ensure that for academics, all of our students have access to a high quality education by learning to read and reading to learn with high quality materials. So we know that those materials in front of the student every day matter deeply. We also wanted to make sure that the programs were in a way that is aligned to student achievement over time. And that's really about our innovative school models. And then the third on educators is making sure that we can move forward in a way that allows for teachers to become a teacher in the state of Tennessee and expand the number of teachers who are able to move into a number of different positions within our schools. So in thinking about those 3 buckets and how they align together, the first is really on Reading 360. In that space, we've really been pushing on early literacy work. There are 8 different components for Reading 360, and that's part of the work we've been doing very closely with TNTP. We had a summer training last year, 10,000 teachers, 97.5% of them had a positive experience with that training, and we are seeing the implementation walkthroughs are translating that training in the summer into actual practice. We've also seen that in that space, the early data on our universal screeners, which we now do 3 times per year for those kindergartners through 3rd graders, is showing clear and marked improvement at a rate that is faster for those teachers who participated in summer than those who didn't. And so we're really trying to benchmark that progress. But one of the positive things that we've seen as a result of this Reading 360 work is we aren't just thinking about teachers. We're looking at the whole vertical alignment pipeline for teachers and principals, instructional leaders, for educator preparation providers, so they are changing their programming to better support teachers, and then really having a comprehensive approach for communities and families, sending decodables home to families. We have 200,000 parents who have signed up for and agreed to participate in a lot of these reading practices that have been incredibly important, not just the decodables at home, but certainly text to their phones
some different kinds of ways. We call them simple moments, etc. The third the other component of that academic section is our Tennessee AllCore. Tennessee AllCore, I believe, is the largest tutoring program in the country. And so there was a lot of talk about, can we start tutoring programs up quickly? Are they going to serve enough kids? Where are all the teachers going to come from? We are not seeing that in Tennessee. We have 150,000 students who will receive high dosage tutoring over the next 3 years in more than 80 districts. We are seeing that we have community partners who will also have community partner grants. We will have free tutoring for high school students, and we have micro grants to families so that our low-income families can pick the tutors of their choice. Altogether, out of our 975,000 students, we will have over 225,000 of them in tutoring over the next 3 years to accelerate some of that learning loss that we saw during the pandemic. So it's a massive program, and we were seeing lots of different people plug in different ways, and happy to talk more about that with anyone who would be interested. The last two briefly are innovative school models. So with innovative school models, right now the governor has proposed $1 million to every single high school, $500,000 to every middle school in the state to redesign that high school experience and ensure that every student, when they enter high school, is able to have work-based learning and opportunities, whether you want to be a welder, you want to be a teacher, you want to be a doctor. And it has a very clear link into the post-secondary programming space. So I'm going to graduate from high school already with dual credit, whether that's in a 2-year or a 4-year or a community college or technical college. That kind of restructuring about what time and space looks like in high school is incredibly important. High school does not have to be desks and rows and chairs and classrooms. We have many high school sites on workforce. We are ensuring that our students are actually doing apprenticeships with doctors and medical offices and rethinking what that experience looks like now that we have those instructional materials in place in that tutoring. And then finally, when we look at our educator components, we have the really great, strong instructional models for early literacy and tutoring. We have the right programming for middle school and high school. You need the teachers. And so one of the things we're most proud of is our Grow Your Own. In the Grow Your Own space, we have over 650 teachers who are now becoming a teacher for free and getting paid to do so because they're working in full-time in our schools. We are the first state to have a teacher occupational apprenticeship, meaning we can now use Department of Labor dollars to pay for your tuition and materials to become a teacher for free. And also that pathway for existing teachers to broaden their professional opportunities. We are paying for our existing teachers to get their special education endorsement or their ESL endorsement at no cost, so that if there are surpluses of, let's say, elementary school teachers, they can fill these high need areas. And then certainly we have our diverse leader network and our aspiring assistant principal network to create, again, that vertical alignment for educators to be able to continue to progress within the profession in whatever role they choose. But altogether and comprehensively, as that aligns to our ESSER packaging, we are saying every single day when students are in the classroom, they have access to and must have access to high quality materials. They need to have access to acceleration opportunities with this massive tutoring program we've launched. They need to have the right models and structures to get them on track to the post-secondary programs of their choice. And you've got to have a highly qualified teacher in front of them. And it's the responsibility of the state to pay for that and be creative on sustainable pathways outside of that work. So I think one of the things that I would end with is just as we think about this one-time ESSER investment, we've done a lot of the things that people are just talking about starting someday. We're doing those now. We are already incentivizing our districts to invest their money strategically in tutoring and academic supports. And we want to make sure that everything we are investing in now is genuinely to have a sustainable path forward after the pandemic, because it's going to take us years to recover, and acceleration is about quality and about speed. And we need to do those with very strategic, clear, and very consistent investments. So we've decided to invest big in a few things and are starting to see that pay off in real time.
Great. Thank you both so much for giving us those overviews. And Commissioner Schwinn, I wanted to ask a little bit about the tutoring programs. I know that one thing that we had talked about was that that tutoring programs that are working in service of acceleration are connected to the work that students are doing in class. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that connection, what that connection looks like in Tennessee, and also more broadly, and maybe this is also a question for Jamila too, I think a lot of reporters are going to be working in areas where the district is saying, oh, well, we're doing tutoring and a summer program and after school programs in service of acceleration. And how can a reporter know when those programs are linked up to the work that students are doing in class and are in service of acceleration?
Sure. So in Tennessee, we have that year-round model. So one of the things, again, with that sustainability is our legislature has been very supportive of this and passed permanent legislation where summer programming is now available for 6 weeks every summer forevermore, in addition to this tutoring program, which will be funded forevermore. That's been really important for districts to want to make the kind of investment in alignment of programming for the school day, for tutoring, and for summer. If it's one-time funding for 2 years, I'm seeing a lot of disconnect in other places where it's let's just get through this. We don't have that mindset. So when you look at our summer school programming, it is an extension of the high quality materials that our students are working with and our teachers are using every single day in classrooms. The tutoring program, what we found is most effective is when that happens during your response to intervention block. Instead of having your small group and then 2 other groups working independently, we now have a full-time teacher in the classroom and another full-time teacher doing 3-to-1 ratio tutoring, so that high dosage, low ratio tutoring that is also using that just-in-time instruction with high quality materials. That partnered with really strong providers. So you think about Zern, we are partnering with Zern for math for tutoring. That aligns to the math curriculum that districts locally adopt. For English language arts, what we're doing is some of that pre-teaching using high quality materials. Those are the kinds of things that create that alignment. What I've seen in districts is that only feels effective because they know that funding is going to be there in a sustainable way. The last thing I would say is the way to bring districts together so they learn from and partner with each other. So it's not a top-down approach. It is the state empowering districts to work together. And that's, for example, a partnership we have with TNTP, where they bring networks of districts together, they do problems of practice, they do walkthroughs together, and again, it reinforces the best practice that you see in your traditional Tier 1 instruction in the classroom.
And then Jamila, I don't know if you can maybe tell us a couple of examples of outside of a tutoring program, what might it look like if in some of the other support systems that schools are putting up, what might that look like when we know that it's aligned to the curriculum, when we know that it's in service of that acceleration?
Yeah, this is such a critical and key question. I'm so glad you asked. I think with learning acceleration and the connection with high quality instructional materials, I actually don't think we've really maximized or got the full return on investment that we could get from high quality materials, because a lot of systems shrink that change to think that it can only be used in the core instructional space or in Tier 1 instruction. So in systems that I think have done this really well, like Penny has alluded to, they are using those same materials or carrying those forward into Tier 2 or into Tier 3. So that it's a stronger experience. Like we've already heard in Tennessee, we also see that happening in Louisiana, where they have a full suite where it talks about their core instructional materials are Eureka, but when they talk about their high dosage tutoring program that they've initiated with ESSER funds, they have carried that forward to say, if you are doing Eureka and you're doing high dosage tutoring, here are the materials that you can use from Eureka to support high dosage tutoring. So I think an important question for us to be asking is if you're doing high dosage tutoring or if you're doing a Tier 3 intervention, what materials are students using and how are you ensuring that those materials align to and connect with what students are experiencing in core instruction? Because we would never want students to be in their core instructional experience to be reading about Phantom Toll Booth, and then in their Tier 2 instructional materials to be reading about rainforest frogs, and then in their Tier 3 instructional materials to be reading about the Titanic. That doesn't connect. It makes a harder instructional experience for students and doesn't allow for that really important knowledge building that needs to happen in literacy or vocabulary building that needs to happen. So I think the most important question for us to be asking when we're talking to systems is, if they are using a different tool or product in those other spaces, how are you ensuring that they're aligned to core instruction and connecting back to core instruction? And we've seen systems really, like the systems who are, again, ahead of the curve, Tennessee, Louisiana, other places that are ahead of the curve, making that as explicit as possible and providing resources and tools that really paint that picture for educators of how to use their core instructional materials in other intervention spaces.
Talking about core instruction, that whole class time, not an intervention, but when all the students are in class in front of a teacher. So if I'm thinking about, okay, what am I looking for there? If I'm a reporter going into a classroom, and what should I be looking for to know if they're doing acceleration? I might not know exactly what those gateway standards are that need to be pulled from previous grades and worked into this instruction. It's pretty in the weeds. So if I'm in a classroom, like, how can I tell the difference between what remediation looks like and what acceleration looks like?
So I think the thing for me that's a quick sniff test is, like, if students are doing things that look like skill drill, like it is disjointed instruction. Now, there is a place, like we know in mathematics, for example, there is a place for fluency practice where I'm working on just doing quick math facts very quickly. But if the entire lesson is looks like a worksheet where students aren't even giving a chance to engage in conversations, do deep thinking, problem solve, work with manipulatives and models, etc., you know that there's something a little off there. You might also look to see, like, are all students kind of doing the same thing? Sometimes in classrooms we see others, like a small number of students doing really challenging work that is grade level, and everyone else doing something that is like much lower grade level or not aligned at all, and just asking those questions of educators. If you're in a literacy classroom, if you don't see students in complex texts, if you don't see students in texts that are really grade level, that are meaningful, you see them with those like quick passage, test passages, things like that, that are not actual text that you could pick up at a bookstore or whatever, that might not pass the sniff test for you. I think the other thing that makes learning acceleration a little hard from the outside observer is it does really require conversations with educators. So I would always say, as opposed to just assuming the worst of educators, assume the best and ask the question or conversation, like, I X today. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you made that decision? Where did that come from? What challenges are your students experiencing? Is that grade level content? Because there may have been, even with learning acceleration, there may be days where they're working on things from prior grades. But if I'm able to really draw that picture of, like, we're going to be doing this for an hour or 2 hours or 2 days, and then we're getting back to X, Y, or Z, that could really make sense. So it does require, I think, as we stress in our overview of, like, it requires collaboration from the educational community, it also requires conversations and collaborations from our broader ecosystem as well, that we are supporting educators through this process, because, as Penny mentioned, it is a long-term process that requires all hands on deck, even beyond our educators. It requires policymakers and even journalists like you to keep us honest, and also to make sure that we're focused on the right things.
Can I just follow up on this? Thank you so much. This is really interesting. Jamila, I'm curious, the same question, I really appreciated your question, Sarah, about like what to look for in the classroom and the observation, and then also what to ask the teachers. Also, we see a lot of announcements, press releases from the Department of Education, from states saying, this is our accelerated learning strategy. You know, what are a few of the questions that can unpack whether what they're saying is really, you know, good acceleration practice, or just using the word because everyone else is using the word?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here from our perspective, and I think it's ask 4 questions down about what implementation looks like. And what, you know, we see the bumper sticker language all the time. That's, I mean, we're very good at that in education. That's part of generating some of the excitement and interest in things. But ultimately, and I think this has actually been harder in Tennessee, is that we are overly focused on the implementation, and every single strategy that we put out, it is mapped from the person at the state agency every level down to what is happening with the student in the classroom. And so if we are putting out something like high dosage tutoring, Everything beneath that includes office hours, where we actually restructure school days one-on-one with individual districts. It means we are personally doing walkthroughs to make sure that it is acceleration using high quality materials. It also means we're creating the implementation networks with high quality partners and providers. And we are personally going through and creating that toolkit and guide for the sustainability of practice and advocating for the policy changes. And so it is very easy to put out a program or to say we are giving funding for this and hope it all works out. But having the accountability, responsibility, and discipline to measure your own performance and have thought through every single detail for the now as well as in the future, that's what I would scrape the surface on, because that is much harder to do. It's not the sexy work, of course, in terms of the fun press releases, but it's the thing that's actually going to change achievement for students and ensure that acceleration happens.
Thank you. Jamila, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I think the reason we put out Learning Acceleration for All, our guide, is exactly what Penny is talking about. Like, if I see a system that their press release immediately talks about classroom level changes, what's happening with the teacher, and they haven't talked about any kind of infrastructure or conditional changes that they need to make in order for those classroom level changes to occur, I already know that it is probably a system built on a fallacy. So it needs to really be, like Penny said, like, do we have high quality materials in place? That is not up to the classroom teacher. That's up to all the leaders who surround that classroom teacher. Do the schools have enough resources and time spent to make learning acceleration work? Those are like the conditions that need to be in place. So it really is about, like, what is the plan, what is the strategy, and what's the implementation going to look like, and what are the conditional changes that our system has made to ensure that educators in the classroom are supported. And often that is what slows down learning acceleration. Like, when we first published Learning Acceleration for All, everyone was super excited. They're like, we want to learning accelerate on Monday. And then when we started talking about really what it requires, they realized that they needed to really go into the back room. Like, Penny is laughing because she's a partner of ours, and we're like, slow down. Like, you have to do all these other things first, because it really is about laying the foundation and creating an environment in which learning acceleration can happen. Learning acceleration is not a practice. It is an outcome that you achieve once you've put certain practices and systems and structures in place. And, like, having that mindset shift for folks, that, like, you can't get to learning acceleration if you haven't put these pieces in place. And so that's the thing that we're really trying to encourage, and would want you all who are in the room today to really dig into, is like, what are the system changes that you've put into place? What gaps did you identify that were holding students back from learning acceleration and previously? And how have you really resolved or solved for those gaps within your system to ensure that teachers are positioned to really do the, like, intimate classroom level practices that learning acceleration requires?
Thank you. We do have a question from EdSource, I believe. Does all of this apply when students are 3 and 4 years behind in math, or does it require a different approach separate from the ideas you've talked about today?
You know, I think what we're thinking, I would say yes and. So every student needs grade level instruction every day, because ultimately we want to push how students are thinking about things. When we're talking about acceleration, it's taking the student from where they are and helping to bridge to where they need to be the next day, especially in math. So in some cases, that's going to be identifying what those specific knowledge and skill gaps are and providing some of that connector or bridge space over to get students to access actual instruction. And that might be they are just missing a very specific component of, let's say, fractions. Lots of students in Tennessee where we're struggling in that area. And it might not be all of fractions, it might be a particular concept. So you're really drilling into what that child needs and bridging over to grade level instruction. What I would say, and I would be interested in Jamila's thoughts here, is the idea that just because a child is 2 to 3 grade levels behind, that they cannot access grade level instruction. We have to eliminate that as our construct of how we provide education. Every child every day needs grade level instruction. Our responsibility is to provide the additional supports through intervention and through tutoring to bridge that gap for the specific lesson that child will have the next day, so that they are able to access that instruction. And so that's that hard part about implementation and reframing and rethinking how we support students. That's why you can't just implement, you can't just take a program and put it in your school and everything's going to be fine. It requires a lot of critical thinking, restructuring of your schedule, very deliberate and strategic planning about the needs of your specific students, and then using high quality instructional materials and support for teachers to make that come together.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. Oh, I was just going to say, yes, like one of the things that we stress is that learning acceleration is not for the mythical average, it is for all students. And when we talk, and that's why I also say that like it could go beyond core instruction. So if you have a student who is several grade levels behind, what we're saying is potentially all the supports that they need won't be confined to core instruction. They will need some tier 2 services or tier 3 services as well.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner, are you having, how's it going finding tutors who are up to this? Seems like this is pretty complex stuff, and you can't just pull someone off the street and you know, start doing it. What are the qualifications for your tutors, and are they up to this fairly complex, you know, process?
Yes, so I think we heard that before summer school too, and there was the who's going to show up for summer school, and the districts were worried. We got to summer school and we were fully staffed. So it is one of those things where if you build it, the teachers will come, because ultimately teachers care deeply about their children. And so what we have found is in tutoring, number one, part-time tutors and after-school tutors does not work as well, because people won't stay in those hourly jobs in the same way as if you hire a full-time staff member. And what we've done is kind of condensed that strategic plan to say, look, we have a grow your own program. We are going to need a lot of future teachers. Let's hire them full time as paraprofessionals. Let's get them trained up very specifically in what we believe are the things they need to do in order to be successful tutors. And we have a free no cost training that we have them go through, as they are also earning their credential. So they are the same people that we are positioning up to earn their bachelor's degree and credential. They're just actually providing very targeted tutoring for our students. We are paying for that to happen in a lot of cases. We also have worked with our ed prep providers so that many of them, including the University of Tennessee system, is requiring that their future teachers and current candidates actually are tutors in Tennessee AllCore. So it's bridging all of these different relationships that we have together around a very clear strategic plan that says we're growing our own teachers. Let's make sure some of that practice is happening as tutors. And let's make sure we get those folks in the door, we're getting them paid as full-time staff. So when we have teachers who retire, we have this person who's been working in that same school as a full-time tutor move directly into that classroom for consistency, relationships, and certainly understanding culture and climate of that building.
I have one other question, but Sarah, do you have any other questions you want to ask?
I mean, one thing I'm curious is if there are any stories around acceleration that either of you think reporters are missing, or ways that reporters are covering efforts to support students through disrupted learning, that things you'd want to see differently, or things you'd want to see more of.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll jump in, but I think there are a couple of things that I continue to be very interested in and pushing on. Is that we've talked a lot about the problem, right? We've heard a lot about that, and certainly that it is worthy of a lot of attention. And now we're talking about investments and what people are going to do. But this has been happening for a year. We've had ESSER $2 for an entire year. We've had ESSER 1 for almost 2 years. And so we should no longer be talking about what we are going to do. So really starting to dive into what are districts and what are state agencies actually doing, and is it working? If the answer is we don't know yet, then that means nothing has actually been implemented. We should be accountable to saying, look, here's what we've done, here's our early data, and here's how we've made changes. And so starting to celebrate those stories where acceleration is happening, and then push on where it is not happening and why, that I think is going to tell a more complete picture of what we're going to look back on 5 or 10 years from now and say, well, what happened in this place but not in that place? Let's start really diving into those practices right now to start to change the narrative, give credit to those districts who are really doing the hard work, and incentivize those other districts to come along so that we get the outcomes for all students and not just for some. So I think really pushing on, we should be at implementation now. We're no longer planning. And I think there's still a lot of talk about what people are going to do. We're doing it. And I think we need to be held accountable to it.
Did you want to add something? No?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the other thing is within that implementation, I don't see us digging in enough with like the coherence of those experiences. We're often being satisfied with like a lot of stuff is happening, but if people can't stop and step back and say like, okay, you got a lot of things, a bevy of resources or menus pointing at learning acceleration? How are students experiencing that? Is that a coherent experience for students? Digging in with families and kids and talking to them about their experience, not just like the adults in the room. I see a lot of us missing that piece of learning acceleration as well.
Thank you. I have something I'm asking. I'd like each of you to give one or two examples, whichever you want, of, and Commissioner, you'll probably talk to things you've already done in your state, but what are one or two really smart ways to spend federal stimulus dollars to accelerate learning? You know, so concrete things you spend the money on so that that happens. And what are two kind of cringeworthy things you're hearing or seeing states or districts spend on that you think are misguided as part of the education recovery?
I'm happy to jump in. And so I will say, I'm going to do the cringeworthy first, so I end on a positive. What I will say is that we have spent a lot of time back and forth with our districts and said no a lot, and said, yep, that might be allowable, but you are going to have to earn the ability to spend money on something like that. So all of that is very, very publicly available, but we've gotten things from like cotton candy machines for teacher support and feeling good. We're like, nope. Football lights, we all love Friday night lights, but that is not what it's not what recovery and acceleration is for. So we have said no to things like that. It is about academics and it is about children. If it's not about that, then we are not approving it. So we've been very, very clear, but sports is lovely. So candy's great, not for this time and place. For the department, what I'm really proud of is that we have stayed focused. I think one of the biggest mistakes I see is that there are lots of little pilots and bright, shiny things that are everywhere. They're not sustainable and they are not at scale. What we have said is we want a proof of concept. So 3 years from now, we are investing deeply across the entire state in a few core things to show the proof of concept at scale and then be able to have that sustainable. So for us, it is early literacy. Every kid's reading on grade level by 3rd grade. We are investing $125 million in that. And it is across the entire state now in legislation and in funding permanently. We are also investing in that Tennessee AllCore, 150,000 students. We had 20% of our students in summer school. That is a legacy program that will continue forever. We're investing in redesigning and reinventing middle and high school so that it is more aligned to post-secondary and backwards mapping down into middle school. And the governor just invested $500 million in that. And then the last is we've got to address teacher shortages. If we don't have amazing people in classrooms, none of this works. And so our Grow Your Own programs, we now have the permanent source of funding for that, but making sure that as teachers and growing within the profession, also for our instructional leaders and instructional supervisors, you have to have that from the commissioner to the student that has got to be aligned across the board. Everyone gets high quality instructional materials and leads with that. Everyone understands what good programming is. It can't just be for certain positions. So that's what we are investing in, those 4 things, all underscored hopefully by the end of this session with a new funding formula that continues to make that a sustainable component of our funding in the state so that these legacy projects aligned to our strategic plan continue long after the pandemic and continue to push on outcomes for students in Tennessee.
Jamila, did you want to give your examples?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say if people are purchasing if people just are purchasing something that has a sticker on it that says learning acceleration, it is not the right move. We have to stop magic bulleting our work as educators is like the most important thing here. I think if you are taking away anything from Penny's conversation about the work that's happening in Tennessee, is that all of the decision making about how funding happens occurs after they deeply understand the problem that they are dealing with, particularly within their state or their system. So it's a hard question, like what should you purchase, what should you not purchase? Because it really should come from what your data says, what your community says, what the context of your system needs, and what Tennessee students need is very different from what Louisiana students need. So I actually would prefer that people aren't kind of following the lemming, but really doing their own deep analysis of what is the context within their particular system to then align and make decisions about what learning acceleration needs to look like and what their resources need to look like, as opposed to taking my advice arbitrarily from a quick conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you. I'm afraid we're out of time, and I apologize. I know there was a few questions in the chat box that we didn't get to. I'm sorry about that. We had limited time. But thank you to our moderator, Sarah Schwartz of Education Week. Check out her coverage of accelerated learning and lots of other things on the curriculum and instruction beat. Also thanks to Jamila Newman of TNTP and to Commissioner Penny Schwinn of the Tennessee Department of Education. Thank you all today, and thanks to our audience. Please, if you would, take a moment when this ends, you're going to get an evaluation survey. Please complete it. It really helps us to get your feedback. Thanks, everyone.